I'm actually pretty excited to follow someone who is doing a planning presentation because this is one more part of planning, and it's a part of planning that I've really found out people don't like to do. and actually it's something that I recently had someone come to me and say, well, we weren't going to work on that area because we've had flycatchers there in the past. And I went, oh no. I mean, it's not the point. I think a lot of times people have a fear of working in an area that has threatened and endangered species, and so they just don't attempt to do restoration. And so I'd like to hopefully move closer to the microphone so you can hear me. I'd like to hopefully move you past the idea of a law and move you into thinking about some of the tools that are very, very useful for endangered species and riparian restoration in particular. So, once a species is listed, it actually has federal protection on federal, state, private land. But Section 7 in particular of the Endangered Species Act requires federal agencies to ensure that any action authorized, funded, or carried out by them is not likely to jeopardize a species or modify critical habitat. It is the responsibility of each one of those agencies to make sure that their actions are not jeopardizing a threatened or endangered species. The process for analyzing the effects is usually done with a biological assessment. And I think people get very scared of the idea of jeopardy and some of the words that are very scary. And so I want to talk about those words first, those scary words. But also I want to talk about really quickly Section 7A1, federal agencies shall also use their authorities to carry out programs for the conservation of endangered and threatened species. So not only do they need to make sure they're not jeopardizing, but they also need to make sure that what they're doing is trying to conserve these species in the process. So the J word that everyone tends to fear. Federal agencies shall ensure their actions are not likely to jeopardize. And jeopardize means not being able to recover that species if you have an action that will no longer allow for the recovery of that species. Jeopardize the continued existence of any threatened or endangered species. When is Section 7 consultation applicable or required? Whenever there's a federal nexus. So Section 7, whenever there is a federal nexus, an action that is funded, authorized, or carried out by a federal agency. Or, also this is important, that the federal agency has a discretionary action. So they need to be able to have discretion in that action. There are times when the federal agency does not have discretion in their action, and that is not considered something that they need to be consulting on. Required consultation, or consultation is required if such a federal action may affect a listed species or critical habitat. And we'll get into how you make that determination. Another word that is actually often feared is the word take. Take is to harass, harm, pursue, hunt, shoot, wound, kill. You get it, the big part. But if you are going to be killing a species, it's very obvious. Some of the parts of take that are a little more confusing come in the definition of harm and harass. So significant habitat modification or degradation actually kills or injured wildlife by significantly impairing essential behavior patterns, including breeding, feeding, or sheltering. And then harassment is an intentional or negligent act, omission, which creates the likelihood of injury of wildlife by annoying it to such an extent, somebody actually wrote all this, to such an extent to significantly disrupt normal behavior patterns, which include feeding, breeding, and sheltering. So the definition of take is very, very large. And this is where I think a lot of people decide, I don't want to even try to decide if I'm taking a species or not, because it pretty much includes everything. So, consultation pathways in determining whether you're going to have take or not, how you come and talk to the Fish and Wildlife Service. Informal is when you actually are going to have no effect. That's a decision that you make. The Fish and Wildlife Service does not determine if your project is going to affect or not affect. It's your decision. And so if you make a no effect call, end of story. You don't come talk to us. We don't have to even talk about it. You've looked at your project, it has no effect. The determination of not likely to adversely affect is something that you then talk with the Fish and Wildlife Service, send in a consultation, the Fish and Wildlife Service concurs, and consultation is concluded. These are usually very, very simple. They're not complex analyses. They're very, very simple, and consultation is concluded. If the agency determines that their action is likely to adversely affect by using a biological assessment, the Fish and Wildlife Service responds with specific timeframes. There's actually legal requirements. And the biological opinion has mandatory terms and conditions that allow for that take. A lot of times you don't want to ask for take, or people think take is a bad word. But the truth is, when you're doing restoration, you're doing other things, there are times when take is necessary and is provided in the form of the terms and conditions in an incidental take statement. And then the consultation is concluded. So we're going to actually go through that process a little more clearly, but that's what gets you between an informal and a formal consultation. So non-federal lands. The Endangered Species Act applies on federal, non-federal, private, state, tribal. What are the tools if you're not talking about federal land? We've actually realized over time, state, private, tribal lands are very, very important for the recovery of species. Many, many of our threatened and endangered species are on these lands that are not federally controlled. So we very much need to work with private landowners and tribes in order to get to recovery for these species. So just to reiterate, on federal and state private land, it's illegal to take a listed species. Many landowners are very, very concerned about endangered species on their property. And a lot of times this leads to not wanting to create habitat, not wanting to do habitat restoration because of the potential to create habitat for a listed species or maintain that habitat that already exists. And so we have Section 10. Section 10 of the Endangered Species Act is actually there to permit these types of activities on private, state, and tribal lands. What this does is it provides an exemption from Section 9 prohibiting take in the Endangered Species Act. It provides an exemption for that. It provides permits for landowners to do activities and basically be legal under the Endangered Species Act. It also provides permits to conduct surveys for listed species in case there could be take as a result of conducting surveys. So you have three basic situations. You could have a private land scenario where a private landowner has a threatened or endangered species and they know they want to do something that would cause incidental take of that species. Then you have another instance where a landowner has no listed species, but they want to do something that would potentially create habitat for a species that may be next door or in the area that would draw that species into their property. And then a third scenario is a landowner currently has no listed species, but actually has a candidate species that could become listed. And so we have Section 10 tools to deal with all of these scenarios. The first scenario would be a habitat conservation plan. This provides mechanisms for authorizing take incidental to otherwise lawful activities. So incidental to any of the habitat restoration, whatever would be going on that property that may cause take. And that it would ensure that the conservation needs of the listed species are considered when non-federal actions are likely to result in that take. Safe harbor agreements are a little different. Safe harbor agreements are voluntary agreements that allow landowners to create or restore habitat for threatened and endangered species and return to baseline if necessary. So this is a tool that is really great for encouraging restoration. If you have an area and a landowner who really doesn't want to do restoration because of the potential for a listed species to come onto the property, a safe harbor agreement is a really great way to go, because that agreement says we go from baseline. If your baseline is 0, you do habitat restoration, you can return to baseline as part of your agreement. If something happens, all your trees die, whatever happens, you can return to baseline under your safe harbor agreement. So this is a tool that actually we have a lot of landowners who want to do habitat restoration, specifically in areas with threatened and endangered species, use safe harbors for that very reason. So examples of actions aren't necessarily actions that you think of just on the ground, bulldozer type actions, but can also include regulations, granting licenses, contracts, leases, easements, or actions directly or indirectly modifying land, water, or air, actions intended to conserve listed species and their habitat. A lot of times, in order to get the restoration and habitat that we need in an area, you're going to need take for a short amount of time in order to get to a better overall landscape goal for a species or a group of species or the entire landscape. You may have to have take in order to get to an overall restoration goal. Some of the typical riparian projects, I've actually worked on the Rio Grande, Pecos, Gila River since 2007 with primarily the southwestern willow flycatcher, yellow-billed cuckoo. So I've done a lot of very similar habitat restoration type activities, but a lot of this is non-vegetation, non-native vegetation removal, plantings, habitat restoration, and work within the river channel or ditches. And so a lot of the type of activities are very, very similar. And once you realize the types of conservation measures, the types of things that you're looking at, they tend to go the same way. So we'll talk about conservation measures, but a lot of these types of activities are going to have very, very similar conservation measures for the species that are in your area. So your conservation measures are often timing restrictions. Some of our species are migratory and not there all the time. Noise restrictions, potentially habitat avoidance, beneficial measures for the species, project relocation. There are times when we may be able to relocate a project or parts of a project, or some project modifications. So what is necessary to determine the effects of a project? The first and most important thing is being clear, and you having a very clear understanding of what your project is going to help the Fish and Wildlife Service understand what your project is. So clearly defining your project. What are you doing? How are you doing it? I very often get project descriptions that will say, we're installing a wildlife water. And I have to call back and say, well, you know, how large of a wildlife water? What does that mean? Do you have access? Do you need to remove trees? What do you need to do? And so the more information you can provide about how you're going to accomplish that installation or whatever that action is actually more important than you think. You may know what you're doing and have the project laid out, but the more information you can provide, the better I have an understanding of the project and what those impacts may be. And so being clear will also help you determine if what you're doing will have an impact on a threatened or endangered species. So is what you're doing going to affect feeding, breeding, sheltering? Is it going to affect habitat? Is it going to affect noise? Do you need to install a power line, a pipeline, all the parts of the project that may actually have an impact on those species? And the more you can do that, the more analyses you can do, you'll have an understanding of what might impact those species. I just went through, but I'm not going to go ahead and read these to you, but the more information you can provide, the more you've actually thought through what your effects to those species will be. I love this saying, actually. The single biggest problem in communication is the illusion that it has taken place. Very much, I have a lot of people who will call me and we will have a 5-minute conversation and be able to work through something. And very quickly, something that may have seemed very daunting for them doesn't necessarily have to be that way. So if you have a question, please contact your local Fish and Wildlife Service, whoever the species lead is. A lot of times what people do is they go to our page, they download a species list that brings up every species in the county, and they get overwhelmed. And a lot of times you can simply talk to someone, talk to other people who've done restoration in your area to figure out what those species are and what the resources are that you'll need for those species. The first communication with the Fish and Wildlife Service should not be a biological opinion. A lot of times, we don't even necessarily need to get to a biological opinion if we work through conservation measures and avoidance measures ahead of time. I thought I had one more slide in here. I guess I don't. But really, the most important thing is pre-planning. We've gone over that before, but please, please, please plan out, analyze what your effects are going to be, and talk to the Fish and Wildlife Service as soon as you can. Question?
My question is actually about the Migratory Bird Act rather than the T&E Species Act, but it has to do with restoration practices during the nesting season and potential impact on Migratory Bird Act. I've heard that with minor restoration there may be an exemption to the Migratory Bird Act. Do you know that, or can you address it, or?
I do not know about the exemption, actually. An exemption to nest, because the Migratory Bird Act really, for restoration, what we recommend is going out and searching for nests ahead of time. So I'm not sure about that. I can get your information and follow up with you.
Okay, yeah, I'll contact you afterwards.
Okay. And different federal agencies have some MOUs, like BLM has some MOUs, so you may be thinking of an MOU with one of those.
So I'm wondering about any differences in the consultation process between sites where T&E species may exist versus sites that also have critical habitat designation. Are there really any differences in that process, or are they the same?
So the process is actually the same. You're going to go through and analyze your project. Critical habitat will be part of that. Where it will be different is if you only have critical habitat. No species have been present, but the habitat is still there. And so in those instances, you'll have to go through and analyze just like you would, but you're analyzing for the critical habitat that's present. So even though the species is not present, if you have critical habitat on the site, you would still have to go through the same analyses and go through your action to determine if you're going to impact that critical habitat. Specifically for threatened and endangered species, it depends on the species. So a lot of times they've been developed over time. The species, we tend to use their recovery plan in the way of BMPs. So we'll tend to point towards the recovery plan and the guidance that's provided in individual recovery plans. If there's not a recovery plan, a lot of times we will have what's called a consultation considerations document, which are things to consider for any given species. And those are developed as species go along. But usually, if a species has a recovery plan, we use that as a form of best management practices. The flycatcher one is actually one of my favorites. I love that recovery plan, and I point to it a lot for those types of questions. Okay, thank you.